people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello, and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, a new civic education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, politics, economics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Rea, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation, and this week's host for George Washington Slept Here. In this new civic education podcast, the format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where we can learn something new. Today's very first interview is with Civil War historian and three-time Lincoln Prize-winning author Alan Guelzo. Good afternoon, Alan.
Good afternoon, Jason.
So glad to have you here. Alan has way too many honors and prizes to be listed in full, but we're going to learn a lot about him today. So this is the first podcast conversation that we have had. It's going to be structured in a way that will keep us on track. We want to explore Alan's origin story, how you became the person sitting here before us, and the current work that you're doing, what's taking up the bulk of your time. And then I want to hear your unique perspective on the state of America today, particularly on the subject of political polarization. And finally, we will end with a quiz, which hopefully will allow listeners to learn something about you they never knew, even the ones who have read all of your books. So, Alan, tell us, where were you born and raised?
Well, surprisingly, I was born not in the United States. I was born in Japan. I was born in Yokohama. My father was U.S. Army. Both my parents were American citizens, but they happened to be in the Far East, since his posting was actually to Japan and to Korea, where he was a translator at the peace talks at Panmunjom that ended the Korean War. One of his specialties was Oriental languages, so he was a translator. I made my debut, you might say, in Japan, and did it in a department store. Now, I have to rush to say, it was a department store that had been converted to an army hospital, so it's not quite as dramatic as it sounds. But on the other hand, the hospital was itself shortly thereafter converted back to a department store, served as such, and in fact, just a year or two ago, a Foreign Service officer who I got to know, sent me photographs from Yokohama of that very department store. So I actually have a vivid image of exactly the place where I was born. Yes, and it really was a department store.
Well, that's amazing. I love it. How long were you there, and when did you wind up back here in Pennsylvania, which is where I believe you grew up?
Well, not long enough to learn the language, I'm sorry to say. But I mostly grew up in the Philadelphia area because that's where my parents were located originally. That's where my grandparents were. So I consider myself, for the most part, a Philadelphia boy. And in that respect, that means that I've had to devote a life of frustration to rooting for the Philadelphia Phillies.
I hear you, and so do lots of people around the area here. Now, I'm curious about your influences and sort of who encouraged you, or what were the experiences that encouraged you eventually into academia and into history. But I know you've mentioned in a number of places, both in writing and in person, your grandmother. So I'm curious about the role your grandmother played, but also your other early influences.
Well, with my parents being committed to the life of the service, which means you move every 6 months, the feeling was that as I got to school age, I needed a little bit more stability than that. So that stability came through my grandparents in the Philadelphia area. And so I was put to school in Philadelphia, actually in the suburbs in Upper Darby. I did not do all that promisingly well in first grade. And that summer following, my grandmother determined that I was going to make up any lost speed, and she bought a series of primers and put me to reading them. And I have this very clear recollection of one very fine summer's day sitting on the front enclosed porch on Concord Avenue, reading a story about King Robert of Sicily. I went back into my grandmother where she sat in her big velour purple chair, I said to her, "What is this?" And she said, "That's history." And Jason, you might say it was a love affair from that moment onwards.
Wow, I can imagine so. So, but what's interesting is before history, if we fast forward to university, you started with biblical studies and
Yes.
seminary and divinity school.
That's right. I had ambitions that way, but history kept elbowing its way in. Because even after I had graduated from seminary, the seminary asked, because I was going on at that point to graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania, if I would teach courses on church history for them. And I did that for a number of years while I was working my way toward the PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. That was in 1986. I did some part-time teaching at Drexel University as well. And then moved on to a teaching post, first of all, at Eastern College, now Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania, again, Philadelphia suburbs. Taught there for, I'm doing some quick mental mathematics here, for 13 years. And from there, moved to Gettysburg College, where I was the Luce professor, L-U-C-E, not L-O-O-S-E. The Luce Professor of Civil War Era Studies, and was the head of the Civil War Era Studies program, and taught there for some 15 years. And then the opportunity was presented to join forces at Princeton, and I have been at Princeton as the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar in the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. And I have been teaching history then really for all of my teaching career, my history of one description or another.
Absolutely. Which is, I want to go backwards a little bit and talk about when you first started, it was not as a Civil War historian or a Lincoln scholar. It was intellectual history that was, and Jonathan Edwards.
Yes.
So tell me about what, because there I see the linchpin of Jonathan Edwards and the religious movements in America to your divinity school studies. I'm curious when Lincoln arrives on the scene for you.
Well, Lincoln always was somewhere in the background. I'd always had a lively interest in the Civil War and in Lincoln. My grandmother enters into this again because the very first biography I ever read of Abraham Lincoln was a comic book biography of Lincoln that I pestered my grandmother to buy for me when we were standing on a train station in Philadelphia, and there was a news agency in the train station, and somehow that took my eye. The front cover had a picture of Abraham Lincoln getting ready to wrestle some anonymous opponent. That, I suppose, was sufficiently dramatic to take my interest. So I pestered and pestered as only an 8 or 9-year-old can do, and she bought it for me. And Jason, believe it or not, I still have that comic book.
Oh, that's amazing.
So that's where I started with Lincoln. So Lincoln was always there in the background. But my real passion had been American intellectual history, the history of ideas. What are the distinctive ideas that make up the galaxy of American thought? And among those, of course, you run the gamut from 17th century Puritanism all the way up to, let's say, 20th century pragmatism and beyond. My inclinations pointed me in the direction of 18th century moral philosophy. And in the American environment, there's no more important figure in 18th century American moral philosophy than Jonathan Edwards. So I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on Edwards on the problem of free will and determinism. And I thought for some time that was really where I was going to camp out as a historian of American philosophy and American ideas. I even obtained a fellowship at Harvard to do work on what would be a follow-up volume to that doctoral dissertation. As I was planning the second volume on free will moving into the 19th and 20th centuries, I recollected that our friend Lincoln had a few things to say on the subject of free will and determinism, and calling himself a fatalist and a believer in the doctrine of necessity. I thought it would be tremendously clever of me if I could give Abraham Lincoln a walk-on part in this new book I was planning. I wrote a paper about Lincoln and his doctrine of necessity, had the opportunity to read it to the Abraham Lincoln Association's annual meetings in Springfield, Illinois. It was well received. And the first thing I knew, I had an overture from a publisher about writing a book about Lincoln's religion.
Which, if I recall, you refused,
I refused
multiple times.
Multiple times. Because I was aware of the fact that there were a number of books about Lincoln and religion, a great many of which had kind of disappeared into the swamp. I really didn't want to join them. But friends were persistent. The editor of this publisher was persistent. And finally I said, look, let me make you an offer. Let me write an intellectual biography of Abraham Lincoln. Not just about his religion, but about the whole galaxy of ideas that he had a part of. And they were agreeable, and that was what became Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President. And once I got my hand into the Lincoln cookie jar, I couldn't get it out. I've never gotten back to writing that follow-up volume on free will and determinism in American thought. So instead, I've been writing a very great deal about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War.
Which we are all grateful for, because it's an incredibly varied sort of field out there of people who are writing for Lincoln. And you talk in the new preface about the golden age of Lincoln scholarship that you didn't personally kick off, but certainly, Redeemer President comes out sort of at the fore of that golden age. And there's some amazing stuff that has come out. Certainly the bicentennial contributed to that scholarship. But your books, I remember a couple of years ago when the short volume you did on Reconstruction came out, and I was already here at Freedom's Foundation, and my immediate thought was, I wish I had this when I was in the classroom teaching Reconstruction, because it is just this slim little volume that gives you everything you need to know if that's all you're going to get to read. And that's part of what I've loved about the stuff that you do. Did you expect 25 years later that Redeemer President was going to still be at play and in some way still filling a gap that no one else has really entered?
If you had said 25 years ago exactly the things that you were saying, I would probably have laughed. I had no expectation of where things were going to take me or what I was going to produce subsequently on the subject of Abraham Lincoln. I had simply written this book, Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, and now it was a very real question. Well, what next? And in fact, I remember sitting at a meeting of the Abraham Lincoln Institute in Washington, D.C., we had the annual symposium that the Institute puts on, and we all went out to lunch, and we were sitting together, a number of us Lincolnians. I'm sitting across the table from Douglas Wilson, quite a formidable Lincolnian in his own right. And as I was talking to Doug, the idea shot through my mind. No one seems to have recently written anything about the Emancipation Proclamation. That then germinated and became, in 2004, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the end of slavery in America. And then once that was out, it was, well, let's look around. Let's see if there's another mountain to climb. And sure enough, 4 years off from that, I'm writing Lincoln and Douglas, the debates that defined America, about the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. And I have to admit, it's really been a step at a time. I have no overarching architectural plan that I checked a box here and I knew I was going to the next box and the next. At this point, Jason, I would have to say I'm still in the position of saying anything can happen.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting that 3 Lincoln Prizes later and dozen or more books and multiple publications leads you to the most, what I would consider the most unlikely biography to write for a man who started with Lincoln and then went to Douglas, is to write the biography of Robert E. Lee. And yet that's exactly what you did. Tell me what led you there. What was it that, as a Union boy raised at your grandmother's knee, made you so interested in Robert E. Lee?
Curiosity. I had spent so much time writing about Lincoln. I had been raised as you say, at my grandmother's knee, hearing her stories about growing up in Philadelphia at the turn of the last century, going to the George Clymer School in North Philadelphia, to which on Decoration Day, as they called it then, now, of course, we call it Memorial Day, old veterans of the Union Army would come to the school in their blue jackets and their little blue caps, and they would tell students like my grandmother what the real story of the Civil War was. And of course, for them, the real story of the Civil War was about Lincoln, it was about emancipation, it was about the Union, and it certainly was not what those miserable, traitorous Johnny Rebs were telling people. So this is what I imbibe at the very beginning. I'm learning from her Civil War songs, not Dixie. I'm learning the Battle Hymn of the Republic,
Absolutely.
Tramp, 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 the boys are marked. I'm learning all the Union songs. So I have, you might say, a hard wiring as a Yankee from Yankee Land, which in the end made it odd for me because I'm wondering, what does the Civil War look like through the other end of the telescope? What would it look like to write about Lee, who at that point was very much a mystery to me? In fact, he remained a mystery to me for a very long time as I began working on this project. He's not an easy person to understand, to get to know, even though he writes extraordinary numbers of letters. His personal correspondence must run out to something like 8,000 letters. Nevertheless, self-revelation is not his long suit. And there are so many ironies about the man that it's enough to make the head itch, not just scratch. So looking at Lee presented an opportunity to do something entirely different and to satisfy a curiosity. And so that became Robert E. Lee, A Life.
I just have to step back and the idea that your grandmother, who you knew well, who helped to raise you, knew or at least met and interacted with people who knew Lincoln. I mean, that's a very short and straight line in American history. And I think it's one of the things that's most fascinating about the subject is we don't have to go very far before somebody who is only just a step removed from these incredible events that we've only read about.
The last certifiable Confederate veteran died in 1951. Pleasant Riggs, who had actually been in an Alabama unit as a teenager and was part of the surrender at Appomattox. The last Union veteran, and the last absolutely certain veteran of the Civil War, died in 1956. So I actually overlap, just a little bit, but I actually overlap the lifetimes of people who fought in the armies of the American Civil War. It really is not that long ago.
So I want to get to, so you've written this amazing biography of Lee. Is there, and you talked about when you gave a talk when it first released and about how Lee meets this almost textbook definition of traitor. And yet all of his contemporaries, including Grant, talked about him being an honorable man. And we're going to come to this discussion later on about the state of the world today, but it seems there's something there that here's someone who, you know, you and I would say he took an oath to defend the Constitution. He abandoned that oath. There's no more question. That's just it. And yet, you know, his principal interlocutor, his principal adversary, Grant, thought he was an honorable man.
And in many respects, Grant was more generous to Lee than Lee was to Grant. It's very curious because Lee, of course, is born to one of the foremost families of the American founding. He's related to Richard Henry Lee, who offers the original resolution that leads to independence. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was this beloved cavalry commander of George Washington, one of that circle of young men that Washington assembles around him, like Alexander Hamilton, like Henry Lawrence, who are his surrogate sons. Grant Well, Grant is distantly related to a Minuteman who fought at Bunker Hill, but otherwise, there's nothing particularly distinguished about Grant, and not only Grant's lineage, but even his Army career. Here's a man who is quite literally forced to resign from the Army because of alcoholism. He had a problem with the bottle. And that in fact was not the hardest part of his life, because when he leaves the Army, life actually gets harder for him. He tries farming, it doesn't work. He tries selling real estate, it doesn't work. He has to pawn his watch in order to buy Christmas presents for his children. And it's not until the Civil War breaks out that, in the search for anyone who's had military experience, the governor of Illinois hands Grant a commission. And from that moment, Grant goes nowhere but up. In 8 years, Jason, in 8 years, he is the president of the United States. Now, contrast that with Lee. It's almost like while one trajectory is going up, the other trajectory is going to go down. Because Lee, in fact, even though he's offered, not directly by Lincoln, but indirectly by an emissary, old Francis Preston Blair, command of the Union armies at the beginning of the Civil War, Lee declines, resigns his Army commission, and he will take command, first of all, of Virginia forces, and then eventually, by the end of the war, he is the general-in-chief of all of the Confederate forces. And he loses. The Confederacy loses. He is compelled to surrender his army. And you might say they cross each other in their trajectories at Appomattox Courthouse. And yet, what is the reputation that these two have enjoyed ever since the war? It has been the Lee who is the embodiment of nobility and chivalry, whereas Ulysses Grant is often treated, and I think very, very wrongly, as a failure in politics, a failure as a president, and the head of an administration that reeked from head to toe of corruption. All of those are misconstructions of Grant. Is it the same thing with Robert E. Lee? Is the celebration of Lee the model of knightly perfection? Is that also flawed? I'm afraid that it is. In so saying, I realize I'm swimming against some tides. The very fact that I would write about Lee raises one set of eyebrows, politically speaking. Right. So I have to run that risk. And so much so that at one point I actually asked my publisher whether it might not be a good idea to put the Lee manuscript into the refrigerator for several years.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you were going to write under the Publius.
No, not something even worse. Now, his response, of course, was, no. This is a very humane biography. This will do very well. We're going to go for it. Everyone's agreed. So we did. On the other hand, in the book, I say very, very frankly, and right at the very beginning, that Robert E. Lee committed treason. Mm-hmm. I can't help but say that. I'm not saying that because I'm trying to be vicious or demeaning. I'm looking at the Constitution's definition of treason. I'm looking at Robert E. Lee and what he did. And Jason, I don't have a way of defining it in any other fashion. What he did was to raise his hand against the Constitution he'd taken an oath to defend, against the flag he had fought under, against the profession that had uniformed him and shaped him and given him prominence and opportunity. He raised his hand against a flag that my father had taken an oath to protect, that my son, who's a career officer, has taken an oath to protect, which I took an oath to protect when I was appointed to the National Council of the Humanities by the president. And I take that oath seriously, the oath of 3 generations. And Robert E. Lee raised his hand against that. How am I to see him in any other light but that of treason? So the biography points in ways that will, I am sure, get me boxed on both ears. But sometimes the historian, like the umpire of the baseball game, has to take that chance when you have to call the balls and strikes as best you see them. And that's what I'm trying to do about Lee. Not to be cruel, not to be vicious, to exercise a measure of compassion on a man who lived, in many respects, a very unhappy life. Yet at the same time, to also understand that compassion cannot float untethered from justice, just as justice cannot float untethered from compassion.
It's a fascinating exploration that I think is, for me, part of the reason why I wanted to talk with you on this podcast, as particularly as we get into talking about the state of America today, because I think this is a very hard thing to do. That for Lee is emblematic of the sides that people take. But I want to put a pin in that, because first I want to talk about Princeton and the James Madison program and what you're doing today. And part of this is out of a mutual friend of ours was telling me about this program that he attended that you moderated on Dvorak. Let me see if I can find the title. Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music. And he said it was fascinating, and that on the panel were certainly a bunch of different viewpoints, and in some ways it spoke to everything that's good about the academy and the marketplace of ideas that we hope that universities are, though we know oftentimes they are not. Tell me about what you're doing at James Madison, and how did you wind up moderating this panel on classical music, Dvorak, and Black classical music?
Well, let me start with the James Madison program, which is a wonderful program at Princeton, which is housed in the Department of Politics at Princeton. It has as its leadership Professor Robert George, who I think many of your listeners will recognize at once. Wonderful executive director in Bradford Wilson, and his assistant, Shiloh Brooks. It's a program which runs courses through the Department of Politics for undergraduates, and I teach some of those courses. It also runs special programs during the academic year, usually on Thursday afternoons, but it varies actually a good deal from program to program and schedule to schedule, on selected topics, a lot of them connected to politics, but not necessarily so. It also runs summer programs. In fact, I am running a summer seminar this July at Princeton on statesmanship in American history, and we're doing that in conjunction with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. It takes seriously the importance of ideas and aspirations in American politics. It takes seriously the Constitution, the founders, the principal figures that have given shape to the American experiment, of which Lincoln, obviously, is a major figure. The program, while it is, strictly speaking, dealing with politics mainly, nevertheless throws a fairly wide arm around a number of American topics. Because in American life, there's no idea that is not connected to politics in one way or another. And I have a very fine musical friend, Joseph Harnowitz, former program director for the Brooklyn Philharmonic, music critic for the New York Times. Joe and I crossed paths because I've always had very lively musical interests, and especially in American music. Joe, also as a professional musician, has had something of a personal crusade to recover the history of American music, especially in the 19th century. And we intersected with that commonality of interest, especially over a new book he had written about Antonin Dvorak and the 3 years that Dvorak spent in New York as head of the National Conservatory of Music. What was striking about Dvorak's tenure in New York was looking around the American landscape. All right, bear in mind, Dvorak is from Bohemia. Today we'd call it the Czech Republic, part then of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He writes a great deal of wonderful music, and I have to triple underscore wonderful. I'm a great lover of Dvorak. He writes a lot of it based on the music he hears all around him from the Bohemian peasantry. And that gets worked in so many different ways into what he writes. Well, he comes to America and he says, why aren't Americans doing the same thing? Especially, he says, what about what W.E.B. Du Bois called the sorrow songs of African Americans, so the plantation songs. He said, this is native to the American soil, and American composers should be using this material, and let me show you how. So while he's in America, he writes his Ninth Symphony from the New World, and he does exactly that. Does it not only with that symphony, does it with the American Suite, does it with his 13th String Quartet, the American Quartet. Alas, it's not a path that people follow, especially in the 1920s, when American culture took this dramatic turn towards modernism.
Right. Jazz, Harlem Renaissance.
It was simply that, well, nothing that has gone before the 1920s should be regarded as in any way worthy of respect. So all that music gets written off. Dvorak's prophecy goes unfulfilled. And I looked at that and said, well, let me tell you something, Joe. That's not the only part of American culture that got erased. Let me talk to you about American philosophy. Because the very same thing happens with American philosophy, which happens with American ethics, happens even in American political thought. The same erasure takes place. It's a parallel between these two. So again, we found ourselves intersecting and we decided, all right, we're going to do a program. It's going to be about Dvorak. It's going to be about Dvorak's prophecy. It's going to be about the vexed fate of Black classical music. But there really is a much larger context, too. It's a context that embraces so many different aspects of American culture. We talked about Dvorak and music, but we also made sure to talk about how that recovery of Dvorak's prophecy is a model for what we want to recover in other places in American life from the American past.
Oh, that's fascinating. And we will definitely have to explore that. I'm really sorry I missed that, but tell me how that conversation, how that program fits into what you were doing in the Madison program at Princeton more generally. What is your goal being there? I know you are director of the Institute for Politics and Statesmanship. You're the Council of Humanities. You made the move from Gettysburg and being almost what one might say is strictly a Civil War historian to something that opened up your ability to talk about lots of different things, including modern politics and modern issues. I know you've written a lot of op-eds since you have been at Princeton addressing the issue of the moment and bringing to bear what your scholarship and research and deep consideration has taught you over the years. So I'm curious about, one, what you're doing, and two, was that something that you were attracted by, or why were you attracted to this sort of new mission in your life as a scholar?
Well, for one thing, the James Madison program is about American ideals and institutions. Those ideals are not just political ideals. Those are ideals about American culture, American music, American art, because in truth, the novelty, the exceptionalism of American politics is something which bleeds right into the way that we do culture, the way that we do music. There are, you might say, these parallels that move together, these resonances, so that we do a kind of politics that, as Alexander Hamilton said, the rest of the world has never seen before, and it becomes the task of the American people to undertake. Well, we see ourselves culturally as doing a number of the same things. So what we create as a republic, we want to create in terms of a Republican art. For instance, let us take Asher Durand, let us take Thomas Cole, let us take Frederick Church, 19th century painters. What are they painting? They are painting, they are visually telling us what a republic is like. What about American composers? They are telling us what America sounds like. So all of these things do, in fact, work together. And when we talk about a program dedicated to American ideals and institutions, we're not just going to limit ourselves to politics. We are, in fact, going to take a very broad view of what those ideals and those institutions really are.
That's really interesting because I think it's a perfect transition to what we want to talk about next, which is America today. I'm particularly interested in the political polarization that we see. But it sounds to me like what you're saying, that you're exploring with the Madison program, is this idea in the 19th century of figuring out what America is. And in the 21st century, I would posit the question, have we forgotten, have we rejected it? And part of that comes from my deep concern and abiding concern that Americans find it harder and harder to recognize that which they share in common with other Americans, that they can see that which divides them. They struggle to see that which ought to unite them. So that's part of what I want to explore together. And I think what you're talking about as far as the 19th century in art and music and architecture, and in some ways it's defining who we are as a nation, as a young nation coming into prominence. It won't be until Spanish-American War and really World War I that we sort of burst on the scene as a nation. But so I guess my first question and the reason I wanted to start with you as our first guest, since 2016, since 2008, we've seen this growing political polarization. We've seen people who disagree and cannot find a way to find anything to agree with other people on. And we hear every once in a while thrown around, whether it's in mainstream media or in the blogosphere or on the internet, this idea of we are heading toward another civil war. So I thought, let's ask the Civil War expert, what is the same and more likely what is different about America today and America in that antebellum decade of the 1850s?
Well, I think there's really two ways of dealing with that question and that problem. One is to reflect on the fact that there has always been polarization in American life and American politics. We should not kid ourselves. It's very easy to read the general histories of America in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when everything seemed to be very predictable because we know what happened. They didn't, and to them on the ground, it always looked like things were coming unstuck. You had Jeffersonians at war with Hamiltonians. You had John Adams and Thomas Jefferson trading the most vile kinds of political invective. And we're talking, at this point, we're talking 1800. We're talking the American Revolution is still something in people's living memories. And yet here are Americans who are perfectly willing to do all kinds of violence to each other. Administrations that are willing to send their officers to go arrest people for saying nasty things about them. I'm thinking of Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. We have presidents who are using the presidential office to do things in return to their political opponents. I think Jefferson, even though Jefferson swore he wasn't going to do that to the Federalists, let's not fool ourselves. He did.
And then generationally, it shifts to John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson doing the same thing all over again, the next generation.
You have this vivid political divide, and you have personalities in those political divides which are behaving in what strike us today as the most vile and intemperate fashion. You have even at a presidential inauguration, you have a crowd of people who are pretty well teetering on the edge of being a riot, taking the White House apart, swinging from the chandeliers, all of it apparently with the blessing of the new incumbent, Andrew Jackson, although that's actually pretty dubious and pretty exaggerated. You have moments like that which are really nasty. And of course, after Andrew Jackson's presidency, we're really only 30 years away from the greatest eruption of all, which is the American Civil War. And the decades between the time Jackson leaves office and the outbreak of the American Civil War, the contest this way, both in terms of rhetoric and actual practice, is extraordinary for its violence. Now, you might think maybe after the Civil War we learned our lesson and we calmed down. No, actually, it simply takes some different forms. And if you look at the history of what happens just in Washington, D.C., in the years after World War I, you have things like the bonus army and the bonus marchers, and they have to be driven away by United States soldiers under the command of no one less at that point than Douglas MacArthur.
Yes.
It's a disgraceful moment of the Hoover presidency, and yet this is the kind of thing that's going on in Washington, D.C. itself. So it's very easy, if you don't have a good grasp of American history, and I'm sorry to say that many people do not. Many people do. And that's something that, in a lot of respects, not only I, but you, Jason, and Freedom's Foundation have spent years upon years upon years working to correct. If we don't have that historical perspective, we're always going to look around ourselves and say, woe is us. How could things ever be worse than this? And I have to tell you, frankly, yes, they could be, and sometimes they have been. So in a way, political polarization is nothing new in American life. In some respects, political polarization almost goes with the territory of being a democracy whose basic principle is that sovereignty resides in the people. It doesn't mean that the people always carry on their political affairs wisely and well. Sometimes they do it wrong-headedly, and sometimes it's violent. But that is one of the risks you run with democracy. The great thing about democracy is that when it works well, nothing else on the planet works better. When it doesn't work well, it can be so embarrassing. So when we look at our historical past, we recognize both ends of that equation. And in a way, it reassures us. It means that, no, we've been in this neighborhood before, and we will get out of this the same way that we have gotten out of it in the past. Hopefully, we will get out of it with more grace than, let's say, we did it in Jacksonian days. And certainly we want to get out of it with much less in the way of violence than we experienced in the Civil War, but we will get out of it. So history gives us some reassurance that way.
Absolutely. There's an ebb and flow that we see, and there are times where we are united. We are more united. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. It was certainly in that Cold War, practicing the duck and cover under your desk, the worst place offers you zero protection, but we all did it. But there was this sense of, there was this outside force that we stood against. So whatever we disagreed on as Americans, there were these things that we agreed on. One of them was, at least in some way, that there was this common enemy. So I always wonder what risks there are when we are so disagreeing about. We can't talk to one another. In the Adams-Jackson period, in the Adams-Jefferson period, when we're sort of at our worst, in the Civil War, the violence of the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s, and when we think about certain places, these are just these convulsive moments in American history that scare us, and rightfully so.
Yeah, they do. They do.
But they also mean there are. One way to correct it is an authoritarian crackdown where we just force everybody to be nice to one another. I don't think any of us want that.
No.
What do we give up and what do we gain when we sort of endure these ebbs and flows?
Part of what democracy demands of us is patience. Patience, unfortunately, is also something which can be in very short supply in a democracy because we do want solutions and we expect them quickly. But democracy requires patience. It requires patience with others. It requires patience with ourselves. The answers to great social problems simply do not present themselves the same way that candy on a rack in the convenience store presents itself. Many times the answers are very complicated. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of self-searching to find. Patience is very much a key. It's also something which has sometimes been in very short supply because I can remember the 70s and the 80s. I remember especially Ronald Reagan as president, and I remember the hectoring that he got from Tip O'Neill as Speaker of the House, from Sam Donaldson at press conferences. And I've often thought back to those days and realized, my goodness, it really was contentious then too. But we have forgotten that contentiousness because it has drifted off our screen. The job of a historian is to keep pushing those things back onto the screen so that we understand to see today in the light of the past. When we do that, I think that actually becomes the key to exercising patience. When we have the sense of reassurance that the stability, the long-term stability of American ideas is there, we can then give ourselves permission to be patient. When we become impatient, it's because terror has seized us, and we are afraid that everything is going to be ending tomorrow and the sky is falling in. When we're told, no, it's not, we've been here before, we've gotten through this, we let out a breath, we count to 10, and we go on and say, all right, we will find a solution to these difficulties. One thing which exacerbates our present situation that is not necessarily so much on the ground in these earlier eras of contention is the immediacy of media. Today, we have television, we have the internet, we have social media. We learn in milliseconds what is going on, and we're constantly bombarded with it so that it seems like we are in a constant, incessant uproar. It is the immediacy of technology which has turned up the volume level on our contentions, so that now it seems it's totally unprecedented. Well, no, the contention isn't unprecedented. It's the volume.
It's the tools.
It's the volume, it's the immediacy, it's the technology which has made it seem that way.
Right. And that was exactly what I thought of when you said patience, is we have lost that virtue to technology that gives us everything we want immediately. There is nothing we can't have. There's nothing I can't order from somewhere online and have it the next day. I mean, I can probably have it the same day if I live in a big enough city. This is, it makes it incredibly challenging. And often people are getting in those first moments probably needs to be clarified because it hasn't had the time of old school media back decades ago where it had to go through an editor and there was this process of vetting that made sure that the information was good. Wasn't perfect, didn't keep back everything, and there's always the human frailties that are hugely problematic. But
remember, Dewey defeats Truman.
Right. Exactly. But there at least were these sort of structural the things that slowed it down, and thus you got a chance to find out, oh, that information is not correct, or we're going to check our sources, or what have you. And that's certainly not happening when somebody posts on Twitter what they think happened someplace.
That spills over into the other part of the answer, and that is about civil war. Are we on some kind of cusp of civil conflict? And that requires a little bit broader of an answer. Are we going to look at a civil war like the one that we fought in 1861 to 65? Because when you say civil war to Americans, that's what they mean. Jumps into mind. And my answer to that pretty categorically is no. Mm-hmm. In order to have had the civil war that we had from 61 to 65, you had to have a number of things in place. One of them, you had to have sectionalism. You had to have a group of states all sharing a common principle, in this case, a dedication to the perpetuation of slavery. You had to have them contiguous to each other to form something that actually looked like a nation state. And you had to have them in such a way that they supported each other. I often say to my classes, if slavery had been legalized in Minnesota, Maine, Florida, and Louisiana, you would never have had a civil war.
Right.
They wouldn't have been able to work together.
But because they drew this line across the middle of the country.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, that's a very narrow way of conceiving of civil war. That may be the way we had one, but it's not the way that other nations have had civil conflict. It's not the way England has had civil wars, such as the Civil War of the 17th century. It's not the way the French had civil wars in the wars of religion. It's not the way that other nations, Sudan, nations in Asia, have endured civil war, China with the Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century. Those have been civil wars, but they're very unlike the American Civil War. It would be possible to think of a civil war as something like a low-level guerrilla conflict. And that, given the capacity that communications technology has for people to communicate, that may be something more likely to occur in an American context. So on the one hand, I'm saying, relax, it's going to be okay. It's not going to be like 61 to 65. At the same time, there are also other kinds of civil conflict which we may run a risk of. And again, here's where the element of technology enters in. Now, one of the difficulties in that is that we also now today enjoy military and communications technology which can much more easily track those kinds of things. That doesn't mean, though, that they might not happen and that they might not occasion great problems. Look, for instance, at the difficulty the Russians had in the 1990s in dealing in the Caucasus. Look, in fact, at the difficulty they have, even now, in dealing with the situation in Ukraine. Look at what happened in the Balkans in the 1990s. These have all been, to a certain degree and under a certain definition, a kind of civil war. And they have taken place in ways that don't conform to our expectations historically of civil war, but nevertheless, they've been just as damaging, if not more so. Will we avoid that kind of civil conflict? On that point, it's much more difficult to be a prophet, which is usually the moment which I remind myself, no, I'm not a prophet. I'm a member of the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians. I'll tell you what happened in the past. I'll let someone else be the prophet.
I understand that. I think you're right. I'm always more optimistic. I think that there is always the chance of conflict, and conflict can express itself in many, many ways. But I do think there are things that we can do, and certainly that's been part of the mission from its inception of Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, to try and educate the participants in our programs, both students and teachers, to see what are the things that we as Americans share in common. And I come back to one of the quintessential, for me, Civil War stories, which is of Joshua Chamberlain at Appomattox. Now, you may correct me and say this story is utterly not true, and if that's the case, I'm still going to tell it at the end of every program. But that is the one where Chamberlain is asked to receive the actual surrender of the Confederate Army, and he orders the Union Army to salute them as fellow Americans. And again, if it's not, maybe I'm going to say, don't even tell me if it's not true, because I want to believe that it's true, because I think it is something that's to me, the height of what it means to be an American is to recognize, even having just finished war, to be able to say, okay, there's something we share. There's something that is worth overcoming the anger and the bitterness and great sadness over friends and brothers who were lost in this war, and how this nation was rendered apart. And it would take us decades and a century, and maybe in some ways we are still trying to put the pieces back together.
Well, Jason, I'm going to do some violence here.
Okay.
Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was a great self-promoter.
Yep, I believe that.
And the story he tells about saluting John Gordon and getting a salute in return as Gordon is surrendering his Confederates, unfortunately doesn't have any corroboration from anyone else.
That's what I was afraid you were going to say.
I'm sorry to prick the balloon, but I'm going to make up for that.
Okay.
By telling you an even better Appomattox story. And it's one that occurs in the McLean parlor, the home of Wilmer McLean, where the surrender documents were actually signed. Robert E. Lee is there with his secretary, Colonel Marshall. Lee is there, Grant rather, is there with some of his principal officers, and especially his military secretary, Lieutenant Colonel Eli S. Parker. Now, the interesting thing about Parker is that Parker was actually a full-blood Seneca sachem of the Tonawanda Seneca. He had gotten an engineering education at Rensselaer Polytechnic, and Grant got to know him out in Illinois in the years before the war. He had this beautiful copperplate handwriting, and so Grant picks him as his military secretary. So here you have a very burly, swarthy complected Seneca chieftain who is the military secretary and lieutenant colonel on Grant's staff. Now, after the surrender documents were exchanged, Grant brought a number of his other officers into the room and began introducing them to Lee, and Lee would go and shake hands with them. Lee had known some of them before the war. When he's introduced to Lieutenant Colonel Parker, Lee stops, stares at him, and this little shiver of apprehension runs through the room. Did Lee think he was being introduced to a black man and being insulted at his surrender by this? Or, before the Civil War, Lee had commanded the old 2nd Cavalry down in Texas. He had been a chaser of the Comanches around the landscape. Was Lee feeling he was insulted by somehow being introduced to an Indian chieftain? And then the moment passes. Lee puts out his hand, shakes hands with Parker, and says to Parker, "Well, I'm glad to meet at last a real American." To which Parker replies, "General Lee, we are all Americans." To me, that's one of the greatest moments of the Civil War.
Absolutely. I'm going to start telling that story.
Yeah, that's a great story.
So there is, you make this reference in the preface to, the new preface to Redeemer President, where you say, and I think it speaks volumes to what we're talking about, where Abraham Lincoln says, "Moral principle is all or nearly all that unites us of the North," he said in 1856. "Pity 'tis not I've misquoted this. Pity it is not
about pecuniary
it is a looser
right.
bond than pecuniary interest. This idea of moral principle, this idea of what we share in common, and I had this thought also. It was the law partner of Lincoln from Springfield who talks about how it's something like he knew his Bible and he knew his Shakespeare, and that got me thinking. It's like there used to be these frames of reference. The Bible, Shakespeare. I think at some point, every American is familiar with the Declaration of Independence, and most of them had at one point had to memorize it, or at least the opening paragraphs of it. This idea that there are these moral principles that that everybody shared. And it seems to me that that's one of, as well as social media and lightning fast communication, the shattering of these frames of reference, these stories that everybody shared in common. When MASH, the television show, had its final, episode, it was some ridiculous number, like 40 or 50 or 75 million people who all sat and watched it together. And we don't have that anymore. We don't have these outside things that draw us together. We don't all learn Shakespeare. We're not all from similar churches learning the same biblical stories. In fact, most Americans aren't going to church at all and to hear those stories, any kind of church. And so I wonder what you think of this idea that having lost these frames of reference is part of what we're struggling with.
I think it's a particular problem for us because Americans do not identify themselves. They do not bind themselves to each other in the way that other nations and empires in the past have, which have relied on blood, race, soil, ethnicity, religion, language. We don't have any of those things. We are bound together by a proposition. This is what Lincoln said at Gettysburg. This nation is conceived in liberty and dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. Jason, think for a moment how that sounded in 1863. Up till this point in history, you don't create nations around propositions. Nations are created by those factors of blood and soil and race and language and so on. The idea that you would create a nation around something as bloodless as a proposition would have made, and did make, reactionary European political thinkers guffaw with laughter. How do you do that? That's like trying to put a bundle of sticks together with nothing to glue them. And yet, the American experiment had been exactly that. It had this confidence that people, in fact, could find unity in those ideas, and especially in those moral principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And Lincoln believed that with every fiber of his being. When he came to Philadelphia in February of 1861, he's on his journey from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration. He stops at Independence Hall, and there he speaks, actually gives two different speeches at Independence Hall, but he comes outside and he participates in the flag raising because it's Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1861. He says when he talks to people at Independence Hall that he has never had an idea in politics that he did not get from the Declaration of Independence. And rather than surrender that, he said, I would rather be assassinated on the spot. 4 years and some weeks later, he is assassinated and lies in state in that very same Independence Hall, where 300,000 mourners file past the casket to view him one last time. He believed heart and soul in the ideas that bound us together. And he participated in a culture that supported that. He knew his Bible. He could quote it off without any difficulty that way. Granted, he's not got much in the way of a distinct religious profile himself personally, but he certainly knows the elements of the Bible. And anyone who tried to contest him with that would find themselves losing very quickly. He knew his Shakespeare. He could recite chunks of Shakespeare off by heart, and not just by Shakespeare. He could recite Alexander Pope. He could recite all kinds of poets this way. He had a wonderful memory for picking things up like that. But he understood that Americans were something very, very different in human history, bound together by an idea, bound together by a moral principle. In Europe, people looked at what was happening in America. They looked at Lincoln, they looked at the Civil War, and they said, see, this is what we've said all along. The Earl of Shrewsbury, in November of 1861, gives a speech. It's printed in the British newspapers, picked up and reprinted in America, in which Shrewsbury predicts this Civil War in America means the end of democracy in America. This is proof democracy doesn't work. The experiment has failed. America is going to wind up with an aristocracy, maybe not dukes and earls, but it's going to wind up with an aristocracy, and it's going to happen. You're going to see it take place. In a lot of respects, what Lincoln understood the Civil War to be about was, as he put it at Gettysburg, a test of whether this nation or any nation, so conceived, so dedicated to a proposition, could endure. His great confidence was that we would endure, and we did. And I think in large measure because of the leadership and the confidence he manifested. What we need from us today is a response similar to that. It's the response he calls for at Gettysburg, dedicating ourselves. You know, he just doesn't say at the Gettysburg Cemetery, well, we're going to consecrate the cemetery. I am going to say some nice things about the Union soldiers who were buried here, and then it'll be sacred ground. No, he says, something else has to happen here. We have to dedicate ourselves. He takes a commemorative event and turns it into a moment that propels us to action. Dedicate yourselves. And every generation of Americans has to dedicate themselves similarly. It's very open-ended that way because every generation faces that same challenge. Can this so conceived and so dedicated nation, can it endure? Can it defy all the expectations of the dukes and tyrants and kings and emperors and continue to prosper? The great thing Lincoln said about Henry Clay, his beau ideal of a statesman, was that Clay loved his country. First of all, because it was his country. It's a natural instinct. But more, Lincoln said, more because Henry Clay loved his country for the example that it provided that free men could prosper, that we could, in fact, pull off this remarkably improbable arrangement of being dedicated to that proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln had confidence in that. He called upon his fellow citizens to be confident in that. And I think those words still speak to us and call from us that confidence, that that proposition is real, that it is not going to fall apart, that it is not going to be trampled underground by foolishness and folly, and that we can go forward as, he put it, as this nation under God.
Absolutely. That is just the way and to put it. And we have to come back and talk about leadership in a future episode, because it's one of the things that Lincoln offers in spades that, you know, it feels like maybe we could use some more. I have to tell you my favorite Henry Clay story. When I was still teaching, I did a summer where I was an Adams Scholar at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so I spent a lot of time in microfiche, you know, looking at letters. And one of the things I got to look at was the John Quincy Adams, one of his journals. Of course, he kept 3 journals all the time from the age of 15 when he first went to, you know, Catherine the Great's court, and he kept them for the rest of his life. But I just focused on Ghent, when he and Henry Clay were representing the United States in trying to bring the War of 1812 to a conclusion. So this is around 1814. And John Quincy Adams, in his very typical New England puritanical way, is up before dawn to write in his journal. And he writes this comment in his journal about how he ran into Henry Clay, who was just going to bed. and it just reads as so absolutely real, but also, and again, this is me, the optimist, and the optimistic patriot, who here are 2 people who could not be more different. And yet they both deeply loved their new young country, to the point of going to Ghent and negotiating. I mean, we know that crossing the Atlantic was always dangerous, but these were the risks that they would take for their country. And yet they were absolutely, opposite. Here is the Henry Clay, the frontiersman, the smokes and drinks and plays cards, and John Quincy would never think of doing any of those things.
Oh no, Henry Clay was this raffish man of the world. I mean, just lean back in your chair. We're going to have a good time, folks. And Quincy Adams is like, what? But the funny thing is, it was exactly the same distinction that you see between Quincy Adams's father and Benjamin Franklin.
Absolutely.
A generation before.
Absolutely.
It was 2 ships passing in the night.
And yet, and this is where I'll wrap this up. And yet, as different as those 2 groupings were, they managed to work together for the betterment of the country. Even though personally there was, there might have been animus, there was certainly a respect, number one, which for Freedom's Foundation is one of those pillars of civic responsibility we teach to young people. And they were able to put whatever their disagreements were aside in order to accomplish what they needed to for the sake of the nation. And to me, those are the stories, and those are the lessons, and those are the frames of reference that we need to give to young people if we hope to turn down the temperature within society.
And we needed them both.
Yes.
We needed Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. we needed John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And we could get all of them together because fundamentally, all of them, no matter how much they quarreled with each other and said nasty things about each other in their letters and their journals, they were, at the end of the day, rooted in that proposition. Rooted in knowing that all men are created equal and that the American Republic embodies that, lives that, breathes that. There will be, across the American landscape, people as different from each other as Franklin was from John Adams, as Clay was from Quincy Adams, and that will be just fine. We can have all the difference and indulge all the difference we like, so long as we are committed to that fundamental proposition, to that moral principle that Lincoln said is all that unites us. Put that into place, and everything goes with it.
There you go. Well, a tradition that we're going to create, right, starting today, for this podcast is to end with a little quiz, and so we're going to go through a couple of questions. So, number one, excluding Washington and Lincoln, who's your favorite president?
Ooh, this is difficult. This is very difficult. But I think I will probably select Ronald Reagan.
Okay. Number two, and this one I will tell you it was inspired by the preface of Redeemer President, and so I think I know the answer. Who was the best candidate who never became president?
Henry Clay.
Okay. See, I was expecting to say Jack Kemp.
No.
Okay.
No, Henry Clay. Jack Kemp was formidable competition, but I'd have to say Henry Clay.
Okay.
If we had elected Henry Clay as president in 1848, we might not have had the Civil War that we had. If we'd elected Henry Clay in 1844, we might not have had the Civil War that we had.
That's so interesting because, that's what this is a whole nother podcast. But, this is the inevitability of history, and that good historians like you teach us that there's nothing inevitable, that even simple single changes could have changed the trajectory. And that's an interesting one. What one thing would you want every American to learn more about from history?
Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. If you had not become a historian, what would you be today?
Probably a paper hanger.
This one, so I'll give you an example. But here's the question. What is the pet peeve that annoys you the most? Mine is people who confuse number and amount.
Mine is people who confuse succession and secession, ordinance and ordnance, and cavalry and calvary.
Calvary.
Pet peeves.
Yes. Favorite movie, show, or opera?
Favorite movie? Hands down, it's Chariots of Fire.
Great one. What one thing would most people be surprised to learn about you?
I think they would be surprised to learn many things, but probably the fact that I was born in Japan would take them by surprise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know I was. What American invention do you think most changed the world?
The telegraph.
The telegraph. Who's the historian who wrote What Hath God Wrought?
Daniel Walker Howe.
Yes, and he talks about the telegraph at the center of that story.
And Dan Howe is a great historian whom I hold in professional and personal reverence.
I was able to meet him once. I got him to participate in a program that we did, and he was brilliant. Really, really wonderful. If you could meet just one historical person, who would it be? Lincoln. And final question, bourbon or scotch?
Scotch.
Excellent. Alan, thank you. This was terrific. I can't think of a better way to have started off this podcast. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, but it's wonderful to be here once again at Freedom's Foundation here in wonderful Valley Forge, where we have all around us the reminders of what it cost to become America.
Absolutely. Not only do I want to thank Alan, I want to thank our producers, Laura Kennedy and Sarah Rasmussen. And most of all, I want to thank our listeners. Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and tell your friends. To learn more about Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, check out our website at freedomsfoundation.org and follow us on social media, Instagram and Facebook at Freedom's Foundation, and on Twitter at FFVF. And you can email us at GWSH podcast. That's as in George Washington Slept Here, podcast at gmail.com with your comments, questions, or suggestions. And we can't wait to be here again. Thank you, everyone.